I gave my brother $999 every single week, but at our family dinner he slammed his phone on the table and called me a cheapskate. My parents actually took his side, telling me I needed to sacrifice more for his luxury lifestyle. I just smiled, pulled out my phone and canceled everything: his allowance, his wife's credit cards, and my parents' mortgage payments. When the waiter brought our $1,500 dinner bill, I paid for my own iced tea and walked out. This morning, his wife showed up crying at my door while he screamed through the phone, begging me not to cut them off. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who drained your life. The smell of truffle mac and cheese and gourmet fried chicken filled the private dining room at one of Atlanta's most expensive soul food restaurants. I had booked this room weeks ago to celebrate my mother Yvonne for her birthday. I was paying for everything, of course. I always paid. The evening was going smoothly until my older brother Jamal threw his brand new smartphone directly onto the center of the table. It landed with a loud thud right next to my water glass. The screen was lit up, showing a bank notification for the weekly automatic wire transfer I had set up for him 3 years ago. $999. Jamal scoffed, his voice loud enough to make the waiter by the door flinch. Are you serious right now, Maya? I told you I needed a $2,000 bump this week for my crypto investor meetings. What am I supposed to do with this trash? I carefully set down my fork and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I kept my voice perfectly level. I asked him if there was a problem with the transfer. Yeah, there is a major problem. Jamal leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his tailored designer polo. He asked if I thought he was a beggar. He said $1,000 in this city does not even cover the gas for his luxury SUV and a decent lunch to wine and dine his clients. He told me to stop being such a cheapskate because I have money sitting around doing nothing. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his complaint, my sister-in-law Brittany chimed in. Brittany was a white self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer who spent more time maintaining her artificial tan and curating her social media feed than she did living in the real world. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, tapping her long acrylic nails against the crystal glass. She said, "Terrence is right, Maya." She put on that patronizing, syrupy tone she always used when she was about to deliver a microaggression. She told me to look at my life. She pointed out that I am 31, single, have no kids, and just work in some boring corporate auditing job. She claimed I wear the same plain suits from 3 years ago and live in a modest apartment. She asked what I even spend my money on. She declared that Jamal is carrying the family name. She told me that as a successful Black woman, I should be uplifting my brother and supporting his vision, not holding out on him like a miserable spinster. I stared at her. Uplifting. That was the word they always used when they really meant funding. For 5 years, I had built my career as a top-tier corporate financial auditor. I did not just crunch numbers, I managed the financial compliance for massive supply chain and logistics companies. But to my family, because I did not drive a flashy sports car or post my bank balances online, I was just the boring, unglamorous daughter who was only useful as a walking automated teller machine. Do not look at your sister-in-law like that, my father. David grunted, pointing his steak knife at me. He said Brittany is right. He claimed my brother is on the verge of a massive breakthrough with his startup. He insisted Jamal needs to maintain an image of wealth to attract real money. He reminded me I have a steady paycheck and said family sacrifices for family. He ordered me to send Jamal the extra $2,000 right now and apologize for embarrassing him. I repeated the word embarrassing, shifting my gaze to my mother. Yvonne avoided my eyes, carefully scooping more candied yams onto Jamal's plate, as if he were still a growing boy instead of a 34-year-old man. She told me to just do it. She warned me not to ruin her birthday dinner with my selfish attitude. She said they raised me to share. She claimed my brother is going to be a billionaire soon, and I should be grateful he even lets me invest in his future. I looked around the table. I looked at Jamal with his heavy gold chain and entitled smirk. I looked at Brittany, who was literally wearing a Cartier bracelet I had paid for last Christmas. I looked at my parents, who were sitting comfortably in a home that I paid the mortgage for every single month. They genuinely believed I owed them my entire existence. They thought I was weak. They thought my silence all these years was submission. "You are right," I said, my voice dangerously calm. I leaned back in my chair and pulled out my phone. I told them a cheapskate really has no business pretending to be a philanthropist. Jamal rolled his eyes and asked what I was mumbling about. He told me to just send the wire transfer because he had a party to get to after this. I did not argue. I opened my banking application. With one tap, I canceled the recurring weekly transfer of $999 to Jamal's account. I switched to my American Express application. I located the supplementary platinum card under Brittany, named the one she used to fund her influencer lifestyle. I hit revoke access. Finally, I opened my real estate portal. The automatic monthly payment for David and Yvonne's $4,000 mortgage was scheduled for tomorrow. I deleted the payment method entirely. I locked my phone and placed it in my purse. I said I was done, offering a bright, closed-mouth smile. Jamal grunted, picking up his drink, saying that is good. He told me to see how easy that is when I stop being stubborn. Just then, the waiter approached our table carrying a black leather folder, the birthday dinner bill. He placed it in the center of the table. Jamal did not even look at it. He just waved his hand dismissively toward me, telling the waiter to give it to his sister, because she is handling the tab. "Actually," I said, standing up from my chair and smoothing my skirt. "I announced I am only paying for my garden salad and my iced tea." I pulled a crisp $50 bill from my wallet and handed it directly to the waiter, telling him to keep the change. "I said the rest of the table is on them." My mother gasped, dropping her fork with a loud clatter. She asked what I was doing, noting the bill is $1,500. I said I know, sliding my purse onto my shoulder. I told her that, like Brittany said, I am just a cheap spinster with a boring corporate job, so I really need to start watching my budget. Jamal laughed, a nervous sound that barely masked his sudden panic. He told me to stop playing around and just pay the bill so we can leave. I looked down at him, feeling the heavy chains of familial obligation finally snap and fall away. I told him I am not playing. I announced that I canceled his weekly transfer. I told them I canceled Brittany's credit card. I looked at my parents and told them they might want to call the bank tomorrow because I just canceled their mortgage payments too. The blood drained from Brittany's face. She frantically grabbed her phone. Right on cue, a notification pinged loudly in the quiet room. Her scheduled payment for a luxury shopping subscription had just been declined. She shrieked, her voice cracking, asking if I canceled her card. I suggested she start paying for her own lifestyle and turned toward the door. I told Jamal to try not to choke on the bill because I hear the collection agencies move fast these days. I walked out of the restaurant with my head held high, ignoring the sudden chaotic shouting erupting from their table. My phone immediately started vibrating with calls from my brother, but I just stepped into the cool night air, feeling a sense of absolute freedom I had never known before. The pounding on my front door started exactly at 6 in the morning. It was the frantic, desperate hammering of someone whose fake reality was crashing down. I did not rush. I took my time tying my silk robe and walked slowly to the entryway. I checked the security camera monitor. Brittany was standing on my welcome mat. Her usually perfect blonde hair was a tangled mess, and dark mascara tracks stained her cheeks. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the heavy wooden door just a few inches, leaving the security chain engaged. She practically shoved her face into the cracks, sobbing loudly. She begged me to listen and said she was so sorry about last night. She claimed she had drank way too much champagne and did not mean those hurtful things she said at the dinner table. She pleaded with me to please just turn the credit card back on. I stared at her, letting her theatrical tears fall without offering any comfort. I asked her why she was banging on my door before the sun was even fully up on a Sunday. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic wail, telling me the repo men were literally circling their neighborhood. She said Jamal had missed 3 consecutive payments on his luxury vehicle, and her car lease was bouncing because the account linked to it was frozen. She cried that they were going to take her car and she had important brand deals to drive to today. She used her classic white tears, the same manipulative tactic she always deployed to play the ultimate victim. She said I was destroying her life, and asked how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own family over a tiny misunderstanding. I looked her up and down, taking in her entire pathetic presentation. Despite her messy hair and running makeup, she was clutching a brand new limited edition Prada handbag against her side. It was a bag I knew cost at least $4,000. I kept my voice perfectly flat and told her she was not my family. I pointed directly at her hand. I told her that Prada bag alone could cover her car lease for the next 3 months. I suggested she march down to the nearest luxury consignment shop and learn how to budget like the rest of us boring corporate workers she despised so much. She gasped, pulling the bag behind her back defensively. She whined that she needed it for her influencer aesthetic and absolutely could not sell it because her followers would notice. I told her then she better get used to taking the city bus. I gently but firmly shut the door right in the middle of her next loud sob, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying click. I walked into my kitchen feeling lighter than I had in years and started brewing my morning coffee. I had barely poured my first cup when my phone began vibrating aggressively across the granite countertop. The caller identification flashed with the name of my brother. I let it ring 4 times, making him wait, before I finally swiped to answer. His voice exploded through the speaker so loud I had to hold the device away from my ear. He screamed, asking what the hell was wrong with me. He yelled that Brittany was having a massive panic attack in my driveway and his phone was blowing up with declined transaction alerts from every subscription service he owned. He demanded I fix this right now and told me I was acting like an insane person over one little joke at a birthday dinner. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the dark roast. I told him it was not a joke. I reminded him that he threw his phone at my plate and called me a cheapskate. I told him he complained about his weekly allowance in front of our parents, who then demanded even more money from me while sitting in a house I pay for. Jamal scoffed, his voice dripping with that same unearned arrogance. He told me $1,000 a week was nothing to me. He said I was just hoarding my corporate wealth while my own blood brother was trying to build a massive investment empire. He said if I really cared about family, I would have been sending 2,000 or 3,000 a week without him having to ask. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I told him he is a 34-year-old man who claims to be a cryptocurrency investing genius but does not even understand basic tax law. He went completely silent for a second before aggressively asking what I was talking about. I explained it to him slowly, using my cold, professional auditor voice. I told him the Internal Revenue Service has an annual gift tax exclusion limit. I explained that by sending him exactly $999 a week, I kept the yearly total just under the strict threshold that would require me to report it and trigger a massive tax liability for both of us. I told him I specifically structured those exact payments to protect his arrogant, ignorant self from getting audited and destroyed by the federal government. I let that sink in. I heard him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, the reality of his own stupidity finally washing over him. I told him I did the math to keep him safe. I told him I quietly protected his fake billionaire lifestyle while he paraded around pretending he was a self-made man. But since my careful financial planning was just cheapskate garbage to him, he no longer had to worry about my interference. I told him from now on he could fund his own empire and deal with the taxes himself. Jamal began speaking again, but the arrogant shouting was replaced by a sudden, desperate panic. He stammered, asking me to hold on and wait a minute. He said we did not need to do this and begged me to just turn the bank transfers back on today. He promised he would manage the taxes himself and never complain again. He pleaded with me not to cut them off because he had major investor deadlines coming up this week and needed cash liquidity. I told him I was completely done managing his life and his lies. I advised him to call our parents for a financial bailout since they truly believe he is an unstoppable genius. I ended the call immediately and blocked his number. I leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling a deep, satisfying calm wash over my body. For 3 years I had carried the heavy, crushing weight of their entitlement. Now my shoulders felt incredibly light. I took another sip of coffee, planning to enjoy a peaceful, quiet Sunday for the first time in recent memory. Then my phone rang again, breaking the silence. This time it was not Jamal or my parents or Brittany. It was Julian, my corporate financial lawyer and one of the only people I trusted implicitly. Julian never called on a Sunday morning unless a major corporate acquisition was falling apart or a client was facing federal indictment. I answered the phone, greeting him and asking if everything was all right. Maya Julian said, his voice tight and incredibly urgent. He did not bother with any friendly pleasantries or small talk. He asked me exactly where I was and if I was at a secure, safe location. I stood up straight, my heart rate instantly picking up speed. I told him I was at home alone in my kitchen. He told me to listen to him very carefully and not to panic. He said the high-level identity monitoring service we set up for my executive accounts just triggered a massive critical alert. He explained that someone had somehow bypassed the secondary security freezes on my personal credit file late last night. I asked him what he meant and how that was even possible given the strict safeguards we had in place. Julian took a sharp breath that sounded loud over the phone speaker. He told me that exactly 20 minutes ago, a commercial business loan for $250,000 was originated and formally approved using my social security number. $250,000. The number echoed in my quiet kitchen, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. I asked Julian how this was possible with all my fraud alerts active. He explained that whoever did this possessed my original social security card, my birth certificate, and my most recent tax returns. They had bypassed the digital locks by providing physical verification documents to a regional bank manager in person. There was only one place those physical documents were kept: a fireproof safe in my parents' house. I did not scream. I did not cry. My corporate auditor instincts kicked into overdrive, suppressing the raw betrayal threatening to consume me. I told Julian to pull the Internet Protocol address of the loan origination device and trace the deposit routing numbers immediately. Within 10 minutes, my secure email inbox pinged. Julian had found it. The loan application was submitted from a private network registered to a luxury penthouse suite in Midtown. It was Jamal and Brittany apartment. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door, leaving my coffee untouched on the counter. The drive to Midtown took less than 20 minutes, but my mind raced through a lifetime of my parents making excuses for Jamal. When he crashed my first car at 16, they said it was my fault for parking it too close to the street. When he stole my college graduation gift money, they claimed he needed it for a business venture that failed 2 weeks later. Now he had escalated from petty theft to federal identity fraud to secure $250,000. I bypassed the concierge at his building, knowing the entry codes, and rode the elevator straight to the penthouse floor. I pounded on his heavy double doors with the flat of my hand, the sound echoing down the quiet corridor. I did not have to wait long. The door swung open and Jamal stood there wearing a silk robe holding a green juice. He actually smirked when he saw me, his posture radiating an unearned arrogance. He told me I got here fast and casually leaned against the doorframe, blocking my path. I stepped right past him, forcing my way into the sprawling foyer. I demanded he call the bank immediately and reverse the fraudulent loan. I told him he committed federal identity theft and wire fraud, and I was not going to let him ruin my financial future to fund his fake lifestyle. Jamal waved his hand dismissively, walking toward his open-concept living room. He poured himself more juice and said I was always so dramatic over basic paperwork. He told me families share credit all the time, and since I completely cut off his allowance yesterday, he had to secure funding for his crypto startup somehow. He claimed my immaculate credit score was just sitting there going to waste while he was trying to build generational wealth for our family name. I stared at him, feeling a cold, absolute disgust. I told him he stole my social security number from our parents' safe. Before he could answer, the guest bedroom door opened and my parents walked out. My mother, Yvonne, was already dressed in her Sunday clothes, clutching her pearl necklace. My father, David, stood tall beside her, glaring at me as if I were the one who had committed a severe crime. My father stepped forward, telling me to lower my voice and stop treating my brother like a common criminal. He proudly admitted he gave Jamal the documents from the safe. He said Jamal was on the verge of a massive breakthrough and needed a strong co-signer to secure the capital. He claimed they were just protecting the family interests because I was acting too emotional and unstable after our dinner disagreement. I looked at my mother, expecting some shred of maternal guilt, but she just sighed and crossed her arms tightly. She told me to drop the issue and let it go. She said Jamal crypto startup is going to make millions, and he will pay the loan back in a few months before I even notice it is there. She ordered me to just call the bank, verify that I authorized the loan, and save my brother's startup before I ruin his entire life over my selfish jealousy. They actually believed they could steal $250,000 in my name and simply order me to accept it. I looked at the three of them standing together, a unified front of entitlement and deep delusion. Brittany peeked her head out from the master bedroom, holding her phone, likely recording the confrontation to play the victim for her followers later. I kept my voice dead calm. I told my father he just confessed to accessory to identity theft. I told Jamal the bank would be receiving a formal police report from me by the end of the day, and I would gladly watch him go to federal prison. Jamal's smirk completely vanished. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. He screamed that I could not do that because the money was already gone. He said it was already transferred into his business accounts and tied up in smart contracts. He told me if I reported it to the police, his investors would pull out and the family would be financially ruined forever. I yanked my arm out of his violent grip. I told him his investors were his problem now. I turned my back on them and walked out of the penthouse, ignoring my mother screaming my name down the hallway, demanding I come back and fix this. When I got back to my house, I locked every door and went straight to my home office. I booted up my encrypted work monitors. If Jamal claimed he had a legitimate crypto startup, I was going to audit every single digital footprint he had ever left on the internet. I pulled his limited liability company records from the state database. I traced the routing numbers Julian had sent me earlier. As a top-tier corporate financial auditor, I specialized in tracking hidden assets and uncovering shell corporations for massive supply chain and logistics companies. Jamal's careless digital trail was like reading a children's book to me. I accessed the public blockchain ledger where he claimed his revolutionary crypto tokens were being actively traded. I ran a deep forensic analysis on the wallet addresses receiving the stolen funds. I sat in the glow of my monitors, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I peeled back the layers of his business. What I found over the next 3 hours made the blood freeze in my veins. Jamal did not have a crypto startup. There was no revolutionary technology. There were no legitimate venture capitalists backing his dreams. His limited liability company was nothing but a hollow shell designed to look like a tech firm. I followed the exact flow of the $250,000 he stole from me. The money was immediately fragmented into dozens of offshore accounts, all linking back to a single highly sophisticated underground network. I cross-referenced the network transaction patterns with federal watch lists my corporate firm had secure access to. The results popped up on my screen, confirming my absolute worst nightmare. My brother was not a tech entrepreneur building a legacy. He was using a fake cryptocurrency project as a money laundering front. The $250,000 had been funneled directly into the accounts of a notoriously violent illegal sports gambling syndicate. He was drowning in debt to very dangerous people, and he had just used my name to pay them off. I sat frozen in the blue glow of my monitors, staring at the offshore account routing numbers. My brother was not just a liar and a thief. He was deeply entangled with a violent underground gambling syndicate. He had literally stolen $250,000 in my name to pay off mob debts. I reached for my phone to call Julian back, but the screen suddenly lit up with dozens of rapid-fire notifications. My assistant at the auditing firm sent me an urgent message telling me to look at Instagram right now. My heart pounded as I opened the application. My timeline was instantly flooded with a live video broadcast from Brittany. She was sitting on the floor of her luxury penthouse wearing no makeup and an oversized gray sweater to look as fragile and small as possible. Her blonde hair was deliberately messy, and tears streamed continuously down her pale cheeks. She had positioned her camera so her massive empty walk-in closet was visible in the background, framing her performance perfectly. She was speaking directly to her 2 million followers, and her voice trembled with rehearsed heartbreak. She paused to wipe her eyes and take a shaky breath, looking straight into the lens before dropping my name. She told them her husband's sister Maya had aggressively seized control of all their family assets overnight. I watched in absolute disgust as Brittany weaponized her white tears against me. She painted a calculated picture of a jealous, angry black woman who could not stand to see her brother succeed. She lied effortlessly to millions of people. She claimed I had hacked into their personal bank accounts and stolen their life savings out of pure spite. She told her massive audience that I was a miserable single woman who hated their happiness. She told her followers that Jamal was a brilliant tech entrepreneur who was just trying to build community wealth and I had intentionally sabotaged his startup to ruin his future. She cried harder, saying they were about to lose their dream home and their cars because of my financial abuse. The comment section on the live video was moving so fast it was a blur of angry text. Her followers were eating up every single word of her false victim narrative. I refreshed my own social media pages, and the backlash was already hitting me like a tidal wave. My personal accounts were flooded with thousands of hateful comments. People I had never met were calling me a thief and a monster. They were leaving death threats and racial slurs in my direct messages. They told me I deserved to be locked in a cage. Then the attack shifted to my professional life. Brittany followers found the corporate auditing firm I had spent 5 years building from the ground up. Within 10 minutes, my business page received thousands of one-star reviews. People were writing long, fake complaints claiming I had stolen their money and audited their companies maliciously. They were tagging the Internal Revenue Service, demanding I be investigated for massive financial crimes. Brittany was intentionally directing a vicious internet mob to completely destroy my professional reputation and my livelihood. My phone rang again. It was my mother, Yvonne. I let it ring. She called a second time, and then a third followed immediately by my father, David. I knew exactly what this coordination meant. My parents had fully endorsed this highly public smear campaign to force me into paying Jamal debt. They truly thought public humiliation would break my spirit and make me surrender everything to them. They thought I would panic and beg them to make Brittany take the video down in exchange for my total financial compliance. I did not panic. I did not post a frantic response video trying to defend myself. I did not log on to plead with strangers who had already decided I was the villain. As a top-tier corporate financial auditor, I knew that digital evidence was permanent. I simply started recording my computer screen, capturing every single second of Brittany live broadcast. I took screenshots of the fake reviews flooding my business page. I gathered every piece of digital defamation she was broadcasting to the world. She was actively committing severe libel and providing me with all the evidence I would ever need to ruin her. I drafted a detailed email to Julian attaching the raw video files and the high-resolution screenshots. I instructed him to begin drafting a massive defamation lawsuit against Brittany and her influencer brand. I told him we would hold her legally responsible for every single dollar of revenue my firm lost due to her orchestrated internet attack. Just as I hit send on the secure email, a sharp, heavy knock echoed through my quiet house. It was not the frantic, desperate pounding Brittany had used earlier this morning. It was measured, heavy, and entirely formal. I walked slowly downstairs and checked the security camera monitor. A tall man in a plain gray suit was standing on my front porch, holding a thick manila envelope. I unlocked the front door and pulled it open just a few inches, keeping the security chain fully engaged so I could speak to him safely. He asked if I was Maya. I confirmed my identity. He thrust the thick envelope through the opening and told me I had been served. He turned around and walked back down my driveway without another word. I closed the heavy front door and locked the deadbolt tight. My hands felt completely numb as I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. I ripped open the top of the envelope and pulled out the paperwork. The official blue seal of the State Superior Court was stamped heavily across the very first page. I read the primary plaintiffs listed at the top of the legal filing. It was David and Yvonne. My own parents were officially taking me to civil court. I scanned the documents, my eyes jumping over the dense legal terminology until I hit the specific charges. I could not breathe. My parents were formally accusing me of severe elder financial abuse. They claimed I had systematically manipulated them into signing over all their assets and had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from their retirement accounts over the past 3 years. They submitted sworn legal affidavits stating I was mentally unstable, prone to violent outbursts, and a direct danger to their physical and financial safety. They claimed my actions at the restaurant last night were proof of a severe psychological breakdown. But that was not the worst part of the lawsuit. I flipped to the second page of the legal petition, and my blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. My parents were not just suing me for financial restitution. They had filed an emergency legal petition for a total permanent conservatorship over my life. They were actively asking a superior court judge to declare me mentally incompetent and strip me of all my basic legal rights. They wanted the court to grant Jamal full executive control over my corporate auditing firm and give him direct access to all of my personal bank accounts and investment portfolios. They were trying to legally erase my entire independent existence just to save a brother who had stolen money from the mob. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents sitting on my kitchen counter. The words elder financial abuse and emergency conservatorship seemed to blur together under the harsh overhead lights. My own parents were trying to legally erase my independence just so Jamal could drain my accounts to pay off a violent gambling syndicate. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly gathered the paperwork, slid it into my leather briefcase, and grabbed my car keys. The drive to Julian's office took 45 minutes. I navigated the busy downtown traffic with absolute precision, my mind operating like a cold, calculating machine. For years, I had played the role of the dutiful daughter, the quiet financial provider who tolerated the disrespect to keep the peace. I let them mock my clothes and my corporate job while I quietly paid their mortgages and funded their luxury lifestyles. That version of Maya died the moment the process server handed me that manila envelope. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Julian was waiting for me in the marble lobby of his law firm. He was wearing his usual tailored dark suit, but his expression was incredibly serious. We walked in silence to his expansive corner office overlooking the city skyline, and I locked the heavy glass door behind us. I pulled the lawsuit documents from my briefcase and pushed them across his polished mahogany desk. I told him they were trying to declare me mentally incompetent. I explained they wanted Jamal named as my legal guardian with total executive control over my corporate auditing firm and my personal wealth. I watched Julian's face as he began reading the petition. Julian did not speak immediately. He carefully reviewed the paperwork, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. He noted that the claims were incredibly malicious. He said they submitted sworn statements claiming my behavior at the restaurant was proof of a severe psychological breakdown. They told the court I was paranoid aggressive and mismanaging my own successful company. Julian asked me what the real trigger was since conservatorships require a compelling emergency to fast-track through the court system. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. I showed him the forensic accounting trail I had uncovered the night before. I pointed to the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, and the fake cryptocurrency limited liability company Jamal had set up. I told Julian that Jamal was in massive debt to an illegal sports betting syndicate. I explained that the $250,000 fraudulent loan he took out in my name was not nearly enough to cover his extreme losses. The underground mob was likely threatening his life or his physical safety. He needed immediate access to my entire liquid net worth to save himself. Since I had cut off his weekly transfers and blocked his access to my credit, he panicked. Julian leaned back in his heavy leather chair, letting out a slow breath. He said Jamal was using our parents as pawns in a highly dangerous game. He explained that by alleging elder financial abuse, Jamal created the perfect emergency pretext for a judge to freeze my assets immediately. He told me if the court granted even a temporary emergency conservatorship, Jamal could completely drain my bank accounts and transfer my business assets before we ever got a chance to present our evidence to a judge. It was a calculated legal ambush designed to paralyze me financially. I felt a cold rage settle deep in my chest. I told Julian I was completely done playing defense. I said for 3 years I let them walk all over me, but now they were trying to steal my absolute freedom and destroy the business I built from nothing. I instructed him to shift our response to a full offensive strategy. I authorized him to file a massive countersuit against Brittany for the defamatory social media video that was currently ruining my professional reputation. I told him we would sue her for millions in lost revenue and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I told him to submit the hard evidence of the identity theft and wire fraud directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation today. I said I wanted Jamal investigated for money laundering and federal bank fraud. I wanted my parents held civilly liable for participating in the scheme and handing over my private documents. I wanted them all to face the brutal reality of the law. Julian nodded, picking up his silver pen. He agreed with my approach entirely. He said we would crush the conservatorship petition first and immediately file for a restraining order against my entire family. He flipped to the back of the lawsuit documents to review the sworn affidavits submitted by my father, David, and my mother, Yvonne. He stared at the final page for a very long time. The office was completely silent except for the faint hum of the city traffic outside the window. Julian frowned and pulled a thick archived file from his desk drawer. It was the original mortgage documentation I had provided to his firm years ago when I first set up the automatic payments for my parents' house. Julian placed the old mortgage contract right next to the new lawsuit affidavits. He pulled a small magnifying glass from his pen cup and hovered over the documents, comparing the ink strokes meticulously. He looked up at me and his face was completely pale. He asked me to come around the desk and look closely at the paperwork. I walked over and leaned down, staring at the pages illuminated by his desk lamp. Julian pointed directly to the signatures at the bottom of the new legal petition. He told me to look at the slant of the letters and the pressure of the pen. He reminded me that my mother always loops her cursive differently, and my father has a distinct sharp break in his signature from an old wrist injury he sustained decades ago. As a financial auditor, my eyes quickly recognized the structural discrepancies. I stared at the blue ink on the fresh court documents. The names David and Yvonne were written there, but they looked too rigid, too perfectly formed. It looked exactly like someone trying very hard to copy a signature rather than signing their own name naturally. Julian looked me dead in the eye. He said my parents did not sign these legal documents. He told me Jamal had forged their signatures on sworn federal court affidavits to steal my life. The cold reality of Julian's words settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. I stared down at the forged signatures on the legal documents, realizing that my brother was not just a desperate gambler, he was a brazen federal criminal. He had completely bypassed my parents, manipulating them into believing he was a genius, while quietly forging their names on sworn legal affidavits to steal my entire existence. I told Julian to add the forgery to our growing pile of evidence for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing our counterstrike, ensuring every legal trap was set and waiting. 3 days later, I was sitting in my corner office at the corporate auditing firm, reviewing a massive compliance file for an international logistics client. I was focused and calm, knowing my legal team was handling the storm. Suddenly, a loud, chaotic shouting erupted from the main reception area down the hall. I heard the sharp, frantic voice of our front desk receptionist asking someone to please lower their voice and stop filming. I stood up from my desk and walked out into the polished marble hallway. There, standing in the middle of our pristine corporate lobby, were Jamal and Brittany. Brittany was holding her phone up high, clearly broadcasting to her followers on social media. She was performing her usual white tears routine, wearing oversized sunglasses and looking visibly distressed. Jamal was violently pointing his finger at our security guard, demanding to speak to the managing director of the firm. He was yelling at the top of his lungs, claiming that his sister was a criminal, a thief, and a mentally unstable woman who was illegally hoarding family assets. He shouted that my firm needed to fire me immediately before I embezzled client funds the way I had allegedly stolen from my own parents. Several of my colleagues stepped out of their offices, watching the spectacle with wide eyes. I did not shrink away or show a single ounce of embarrassment. I walked straight toward them, my heels clicking evenly against the marble floor. I looked at Jamal and told him his public performance was incredibly pathetic. I kept my voice perfectly level, contrasting his unhinged shouting. I suggested that if they wanted to discuss my employment and my alleged crimes, they should step into the main executive conference room instead of screaming in a lobby like desperate children. Jamal smirked, adjusting his designer jacket, clearly thinking his intimidation tactic was working. He told Brittany to keep the camera rolling and followed me down the glass-walled corridor. He said he was going to expose me to my entire firm and ruin my corporate career just like I had ruined his startup. I opened the heavy oak door to the executive conference room and ushered them inside. What Jamal and Brittany did not know was that this specific room was equipped with a state-of-the-art corporate recording system used for international compliance meetings. By stepping inside and loudly threatening me, they were walking directly into a legally monitored environment. I subtly pressed the small activation button under the conference table, ensuring every single word they said would be captured in high-definition audio and video. Brittany immediately started pacing around the large mahogany table, pointing her phone at me. She whined to her audience that I was trapping them in a room and showing my true aggressive nature. Jamal slammed his hands down on the tabletop, leaning aggressively toward me. He told me I had exactly 24 hours to transfer the $250,000 into his offshore account, or he would push the conservatorship lawsuit through the courts and take everything I owned. He threatened to go to the local news and tell them I was a corporate fraud who committed elder abuse against our parents. He demanded I submit to his authority as the head of the family because he was drowning in debt, and I owed him my entire corporate salary to keep his investors happy. I sat back in my leather chair, simply letting the hidden cameras capture every single angle of his extortion attempt. I asked him clearly for the record if he was explicitly demanding I pay his illegal gambling syndicate debts to make the forged lawsuit disappear. Jamal laughed a harsh, arrogant sound. He told me I was too smart for my own good but completely powerless against him. He boasted that our parents would always take his side and the courts would believe a weeping mother over a cold corporate spinster. He demanded I write the check right now or pack up my desk because my career was officially over. Just as the words left his mouth, the heavy oak door to the conference room swung open. My managing director, Marcus, stepped into the room. Marcus was a formidable man with decades of experience dealing with corporate espionage and financial compliance. He was not smiling, and he was certainly not intimidated by Jamal's loud voice or Brittany phone camera. Marcus held a thick red corporate folder in his hands. He looked directly at Jamal and asked if he was the man claiming to be my financial manager. Jamal straightened up immediately, putting on his fake charismatic businessman persona. He puffed out his chest and told Marcus that he was my older brother and the head of our family estate. He claimed he was there to warn the firm about my unstable behavior and secure my severance package. Marcus did not blink. He tossed the thick red folder onto the center of the mahogany table. He told Jamal that corporate security had been waiting for him to show his face in this building. He instructed Brittany to turn off her phone unless she wanted to broadcast her husband committing federal corporate extortion to her 2 million followers. Jamal faltered, his arrogant smile slipping as he looked down at the red folder. He asked Marcus what he was talking about. Marcus looked at me and then back to Jamal. He stated that 3 days ago, a man identifying himself as Jamal contacted the chief financial officer of our largest logistics client. Marcus explained that Jamal had used my name and my corporate title to arrange a secret meeting. He dropped the ultimate bombshell, revealing that Jamal had tried to extort a massive consulting fee from the client, promising to ensure their upcoming federal audit came back clean if they wired $500,000 to his crypto startup. Marcus stated that the client had recorded the entire interaction and immediately forwarded it to our legal department. Jamal's face drained of all color as Marcus' words echoed in the cold conference room. Brittany lowered her phone, her hands shaking violently as she realized she had just live-streamed the managing director of a top-tier corporate auditing firm accusing her husband of federal extortion. Marcus did not wait for Jamal to formulate a lie or try to backtrack. He simply pressed a button on the intercom, and 2 armed corporate security guards entered the room immediately. Marcus informed Jamal that our legal department was forwarding the recording directly to the authorities, and if either of them stepped within 500 feet of the building again, they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. I sat perfectly still, watching them get escorted out like common criminals. My corporate reputation was not just intact, it was bulletproof. I spent the rest of the week working closely with Julian to solidify the defamation lawsuit against Brittany and the countersuit for the forged conservatorship documents. I ignored the frantic voicemails from my parents, who had clearly realized their golden child was rapidly spiraling out of control. But my family had never understood the concept of boundaries or taking no for an answer. They truly believed that if they pressured me hard enough, I would simply fold and give them whatever they demanded. Sunday morning arrived quiet and overcast. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking black coffee when the heavy security gate chime rang. I checked the camera feed on my tablet. It was my father's luxury sedan idling in my driveway. I almost ignored it, but then I saw who was stepping out of the passenger side. It was Pastor Thomas, the head of the massive megachurch my parents attended. He was followed by his 25-year-old son Aaron, who served as the church youth director. My mother, Yvonne, stepped out last, clutching her oversized Bible to her chest, like a physical shield against my supposed sins. They were staging a spiritual intervention. They wanted to use the weight of religious authority and public shame to force me into submission in my own home. I pressed the gate release button and unlocked the front door. I was not going to hide from them anymore. They filed into my living room without waiting for an invitation. Pastor Thomas looked around my home with a sorrowful expression, shaking his head slowly, as if the walls themselves were steeped in wickedness. My mother immediately started crying, telling the pastor how much it broke her heart to see my soul so corrupted by greed and jealousy. She played the role of the grieving, victimized matriarch, perfectly dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Pastor Thomas sat on my sofa and folded his hands together. He looked at me with deep, practiced disappointment. He told me that Jamal was a beacon of light in their congregation, a true Christian businessman who was using his immense wealth to uplift the community. He said my parents had come to him weeping because I had stolen from them and was trying to destroy Jamal out of sheer spite and spiritual darkness. He urged me to fall to my knees, repent for my actions, and return the money I had stolen so the family could heal. He warned me that pride comes before a fall and that heaven was watching my cruel behavior toward my own flesh and blood. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my character to a man who only knew the lies my parents had fed him. I simply walked over to my console table and picked up a manila folder I had prepared just in case my parents tried another desperate ambush. I looked Pastor Thomas in the eye and asked him if he was referring to the incredible generosity Jamal showed last month when he single-handedly paid $80,000 to replace the failing church roof. The pastor nodded proudly, stating that Jamal was a billionaire who never hesitated to give back to the Lord and that I should learn from his selfless example. He told me Jamal was funding the new youth center and had promised to pay off the entire mortgage of the church property by the end of the year. I opened the folder and pulled out the cleared cashier check and the direct wire transfer receipts from my personal bank account to the commercial roofing company. I handed the thick stack of papers to the pastor. I told him Jamal did not pay a single cent for that roof or any other church project. I explained that my parents had called me crying 3 months ago, saying the church was going to be condemned by the city if the roof collapsed and they would lose their spiritual home. I paid the contractors directly to keep the congregation safe and asked my parents to keep my donation anonymous. I told the pastor that Jamal simply took the invoice I paid, slapped his fake cryptocurrency startup logo on a presentation folder, and handed it to the church finance committee to look like a benevolent savior. Pastor Thomas stared at the bank statements, his hands trembling slightly as he read the numbers. The routing numbers matched my personal accounts perfectly. The name of the roofing company was printed clearly at the top of the wire transfer, alongside my signature. He looked up at my parents, who had suddenly gone completely pale and silent. The righteous indignation had entirely vanished from my mother's face, leaving only raw panic. Before the pastor could demand an explanation from my parents, a choked, desperate sob broke the silence in my living room. We all turned to look at Aaron, the youth director. He had dropped to his knees on my hardwood floor, clutching his face in his trembling hands. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving with absolute terror. Pastor Thomas dropped the bank statements and rushed to his son, asking him what was wrong and if he was having a medical emergency. Aaron looked up, his eyes red and completely terrified. He confessed that because Jamal had paid for the roof, he thought the crypto startup was entirely legitimate and backed by real billionaire wealth. He looked at his father and confessed that Jamal had convinced him to invest early before the company went public. Aaron broke down sobbing uncontrollably as he admitted he had secretly taken $50,000 from the church youth ministry building fund and transferred it all to Jamal's fake crypto scheme. Pastor Thomas did not offer any prayers of healing for my parents. He grabbed Aaron by the arm and pulled him up from my hardwood floor. The pastor face was completely rigid with fury as he stared at David and Yvonne. He told them he would be calling an emergency meeting with the church elders and the local authorities regarding the stolen $50,000. He said Jamal was no longer welcome on church grounds and turned his back on my parents, walking out of my house without another word. My parents stood frozen in my living room, their precious public reputation entirely destroyed. I walked over to the front door and held it wide open, waiting for them to leave. They walked past me in total silence, looking completely hollowed out, knowing their entire world was about to collapse. 4 days passed without a single text or phone call from anyone in my family. I knew they were panicking, trying to figure out how to hide Jamal's crimes from the police and the church board. Then, on Thursday evening, my phone rang. It was my mother, Yvonne. Her voice sounded fragile and broken. She was crying softly, telling me how sorry she was for everything. She said the revelation about the church funds had finally opened their eyes to how sick Jamal truly was. She told me they realized they had treated me terribly, and they wanted to make things right. She asked me to come over to their house for a private family dinner on Friday night, just the four of us, so we could heal and figure out how to get Jamal professional help. I knew my mother better than anyone in the world. I knew every inflection of her voice and every manipulative tactic she possessed. She was lying. This was a desperate trap. They were out of options and running out of time before the mob or the police caught up to Jamal. I told my mother I would be there at 7. I did not contact Julian or involve my security team for this specific visit. I needed to handle this final trap myself. I went to a specialty electronics store downtown and purchased a microscopic high-definition audio recording bug. It was no larger than a coin and had a magnetic adhesive backing designed to stick to solid furniture. Then I went to a novelty magic shop and bought a high-quality fountain pen filled with specific disappearing ink. The ink was chemically formulated to vanish completely within 2 hours of touching paper, leaving absolutely no trace behind. I placed the audio bug in my jacket pocket and clipped the pen to my notebook. I was ready to play my part in their grand illusion. I arrived at my parents' house exactly on time. The large suburban home looked quiet and unassuming from the outside. My father opened the door with a sad, welcoming smile. He actually hugged me, which he had not done in years. The dining room table was set with my mother's best fine china, and a massive roast dinner was waiting. Jamal was sitting at the corner of the table looking suitably humbled and exhausted. He did not make eye contact with me. He just stared at his plate, playing the role of the broken son seeking redemption. We sat down and ate in a bizarrely polite atmosphere. My parents complimented my success and apologized for taking Jamal's side. They fed me their practiced lies, wrapping their deceit in warm maternal tones and fatherly pride. I nodded and kept my voice soft, playing the role of the desperate daughter who just wanted her family to love her again. After the plates were cleared, my father sighed heavily and brought out a thick stack of legal documents. He slid them across the table toward me. He told me that Jamal owed very dangerous people a massive amount of money, and the mob had given him until Monday to pay. My father said they were going to sell their house and drain their own retirements to save his life, but the banks needed a few days to process the massive transfers. He looked at me with pleading eyes and said they needed a temporary bridge loan. He explained that these papers were just a temporary power of attorney. He said if I signed them, it would allow him to leverage my corporate assets just for 48 hours to pay the syndicate and keep Jamal alive. He promised on his life that he would void the agreement by Tuesday and I would not lose a single dime. I looked down at the power of attorney documents. They were brutal. They were granting David total executive control over every single bank account and property I owned. If I signed them with a real pen, I would be financially ruined by morning. I looked up at my parents and forced tears into my eyes. I let my voice tremble as I told them I was so scared, but I wanted to save our family. I reached into my bag and pulled out my special pen. I uncapped it and rapidly signed my name on every single page they presented to me, playing the broken, compliant daughter perfectly. As I handed the final page back to my father, I intentionally knocked my cloth napkin off my lap. I bent down under the heavy mahogany dining table to retrieve the napkin. In one smooth, fluid motion, I pulled the magnetic audio bug from my pocket and stuck it directly to the underside of the table, right beneath where my father was sitting. I sat back up, wiping the fake tears from my cheeks. My parents were glowing with absolute relief. My father quickly gathered the documents and locked them inside his briefcase. My mother stood up and kissed my cheek, telling me I was a true blessing to this family. I told them I needed to go home and rest because it had been an emotional night. They walked me to the front door, waving goodbye like a picture-perfect loving family. I walked out to my car and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors. I did not start the engine. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure application connected to the audio bug I had just planted. I put my wireless earpiece in and tapped the live feed button. The audio was crystal clear. I listened closely as the heavy wooden front door closed behind me. Immediately, the polite silence in their house was broken by genuine, cruel laughter. I heard my father laughing loudly, telling Jamal that I was exactly as weak and desperate for approval as they always thought I was. I heard my mother mocking my tears, saying she could not believe how easily I fell for the trap. Then I heard Jamal voice cold and arrogant. He told my father they needed to go to the bank the exact second it opened tomorrow morning. Jamal instructed him to use the power of attorney to wire every single dollar I had to his offshore accounts before I could change my mind. They were actively plotting to steal my entire life savings and leave me with absolutely nothing. They were celebrating their brilliant victory, completely unaware that my dark blue signatures would evaporate in less than an hour, and that I was sitting quietly in my car, recording their entire federal conspiracy. The streetlight cast long shadows across my dashboard as I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat. The wireless earpiece delivered the audio with terrifying clarity. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses inside my parents' dining room. My father was pouring champagne to celebrate their successful extortion. He raised his glass and gave a loud toast to family loyalty and to Jamal's brilliant future. I heard my mother chime in with a joyful laugh. She told my father she always knew I would eventually break. She said I was always too weak and too desperate for their approval to ever put up a real fight. She bragged that all it took was a few tears and a stern voice to make me sign over my entire life savings. They clinked their glasses together in harmony. I stared at their perfectly manicured front lawn, feeling absolutely nothing for the people who raised me. The people who were supposed to protect me were actively celebrating my financial ruin. After a few minutes of cheerful gloating, my father announced he was exhausted. He said he needed to get a good night of sleep so he could be standing outside the bank the second the doors unlocked in the morning. He told Jamal he would march straight to the executive teller and use the power of attorney to drain my accounts completely. He promised to wire every single dollar directly into Jamal's business account before lunchtime. My mother told Jamal and Brittany how much she loved them. She said she was so proud of the man Jamal had become. I listened to their heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor as they walked up the stairs to the master bedroom. The dining room fell completely silent for a long moment. Then I heard the distinct sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Brittany spoke first, and her voice had completely changed. The sweet, fragile tone she used around my parents was gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating edge. She asked Jamal how quickly the international wire transfers would clear once his father initiated the bank request. Jamal told her that international wires usually took a few hours to process through the federal banking system. He said the money would bounce through 3 different shell corporations, before landing safely in an untraceable offshore account. Brittany let out a sigh of relief. She asked him if he had already secured the flight tickets. Jamal confirmed he had paid cash for 2 first-class seats on a private charter plane, leaving the city tomorrow at exactly noon. He told her they would be touching down in Dubai before my parents even realized what had happened. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car tightly. They were not planning to pay the underground gambling syndicate. They were planning to take the $250,000 Jamal had already stolen, plus the millions they expected to steal from me tomorrow, and flee the country entirely. Brittany sounded incredibly excited. She started talking about the luxury penthouse they were going to rent in Dubai, and the shopping sprees she would finally be able to afford. She told Jamal he was a genius for using his naive sister and his gullible parents to fund their new life. Then Brittany asked a question that made the air in my car feel freezing cold. She asked Jamal what would happen to his parents when the illegal gambling syndicate realized the debt was not going to be paid. Jamal let out a harsh, soulless laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of human empathy. He told his wife that David and Yvonne were going to take the fall for everything. He explained that when he first borrowed the money from the mob, he used his parents' home address as the primary collateral location. He said the violent syndicate did not know where he actually lived, but they knew exactly where to find David and Yvonne. Jamal said his parents were acceptable collateral damage for his fresh start. He told Brittany that the mob was not the only problem they would face. He confessed he had filed highly fraudulent tax returns for his fake cryptocurrency startup, and he had intentionally listed David as the primary guarantor. He said the Internal Revenue Service would be coming after his parents for massive tax evasion and federal fraud within the next few months. Jamal stated proudly that between the violent mob enforcers and the federal government, his parents would be completely ruined. He said it was their own fault for being so incredibly stupid and blindly trusting him with their personal information. Brittany giggled softly, but then she paused. I could hear the hesitation in her voice. She asked Jamal what would happen if his parents just decided to sell their massive suburban house and use the profits to flee to another state to escape the mob. She worried they might somehow track them down to Dubai and demand their money back. Jamal laughed again, this time even louder. The sound echoed through the tiny speaker in my ear, making my stomach turn. He told Brittany that his parents could never sell the house to escape the syndicate. He said they did not actually own the property anymore. Brittany asked him what he meant. Jamal dropped a truth so devastating I actually stopped breathing. He told her that 6 months ago, when his crypto scheme first started losing money, he needed a massive injection of cash. He said he took the original deed to the house and forged David's signature on a new set of property documents. He did not go to a traditional bank because they would have required a rigorous background check and proof of income. Instead, he went to a ruthless underground loan shark. He used the house as collateral to secure a high-interest illegal loan of $500,000. Jamal explained that he never made a single repayment on that illegal loan. He told Brittany that the loan shark officially owned the deed to the property now and would likely send enforcers to kick David and Yvonne out onto the street by the end of the month. I sat frozen in my car, staring at the dark house. For 5 years, I had quietly paid the mortgage on that home to give my parents a safe and secure retirement. Now I realized their sanctuary was entirely gone. Jamal had sold their home to a violent criminal, and he was leaving them behind to face the absolute destruction of their lives. I sat frozen in my car, staring at the dark house for a long time. The audio feed buzzed quietly in my earpiece, but the conversation inside had moved on to mundane details about packing luggage. I reached up and disconnected the receiver, feeling a strange sense of absolute calm settling over my mind. My parents had chosen to sacrifice me for their golden child, and now he was going to sacrifice them to a violent loan shark just to save himself. It was a perfect circle of toxic betrayal. I started my car and drove back to my house knowing exactly what was going to happen when the sun came up. The next morning, at exactly 9:15, my phone began to vibrate across my home office desk. The caller identification showed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, answering with a soft, cheerful greeting. My father's voice was frantic and breathless. He asked me what kind of sick joke I was playing. He told me he was standing at the executive teller desk at the bank, and the power of attorney documents were completely blank. He said the manager was looking at him like he was crazy and threatening to call security because he was trying to authorize a massive wire transfer with empty papers. In the background, I could hear Jamal shouting angrily, demanding to know how I had erased the ink. I kept my voice perfectly steady and injected just the right amount of innocent confusion. I told my father I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about and suggested that perhaps he had grabbed the wrong folder from his home office in his rush this morning. I heard Jamal snatch the phone away from my father. He practically growled into the receiver, telling me I was playing a dangerous game and that his investors would ruin me if I did not wire the money right now. I smiled, knowing he was completely trapped by his own desperation. I told Jamal to calm down because I had actually spent the entire morning speaking with my corporate financial advisors. I explained that a temporary bridge loan to pay off unverified debts was much too messy and could trigger an internal revenue service audit for both of us. Instead, I offered him a much better solution. I told him I wanted to make a legitimate documented investment of $1 million directly into his cryptocurrency company. The line went completely dead for a few seconds. I could almost hear the greedy gears turning in Jamal's head. I told him that I realized my behavior had been unsupportive, and I wanted to make things right in a way that would benefit the whole family. But I added one non-negotiable condition. I told him that an investment of this size needed proper public visibility. The annual City Children Charity Gala was happening this coming Saturday night, and our entire social circle would be there. I told Jamal I would present him with a certified check for $1 million in front of the local press and the high society elite. I said I wanted everyone to see him as the visionary entrepreneur he truly was, and to prove that our family was completely united. Jamal's ego instantly overrode any lingering suspicion he had about the blank documents. He took the bait so quickly it was almost pathetic. His tone shifted immediately from angry intimidation to arrogant pride. He boasted that $1 million was exactly the seed capital he needed to take his platform global. He agreed to the gala setup without a second thought, completely blinded by the promise of wealth and public adoration. My father got back on the line, practically weeping with joy. He told me I was finally acting like a true sister and that heaven would reward my generosity. I told them I would see them on Saturday in formal attire and hung up the phone. I immediately dialed Julian's personal number. I instructed my lawyer to draft an ironclad investment contract for the gala. It was not a standard investment agreement. It was a legally binding document that would force Jamal to submit his company to a full federal financial audit the moment he accepted the funds. By signing it in front of witnesses, he would be legally trapping himself in a net of federal regulations he could never escape. Then I took the audio recording from the dining room bug and securely transferred it to an encrypted drive. I sent it directly to a contact Julian had at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with the details of the forged second mortgage. The final pieces of the puzzle were locking into place. Jamal was going to walk into a ballroom expecting a crown, and he was going to leave in handcuffs. Thursday evening, I was sitting in my living room, reviewing the final guest list for the gala event. The house was quiet, and my security system was fully armed. Suddenly, my personal cell phone illuminated with an incoming call from an unknown restricted number. I rarely answered blocked calls, but something told me to pick up. I answered cautiously. A hushed, frantic voice spoke on the other end. It was Brittany. She was crying, but it did not sound like her usual fake performance for social media. Her breathing was ragged and terrified. She told me she was calling from a prepaid phone she bought at a gas station because she knew Jamal was monitoring her devices. She said she knew Jamal was completely out of his mind and that the loan shark enforcers had already started driving past their house slowly. She was terrified for her life and refused to go down with a sinking ship. She told me she wanted to make a deal. Brittany said she had secretly copied Jamal's encrypted hard drive. She explained that the drive contained every single piece of evidence regarding his offshore bank accounts. The forged property deeds, the fake tax returns, and the communications with the illegal gambling syndicate. She told me she would hand the drive directly to me and agree to testify against Jamal and my parents in federal court. But she had a price. She said she needed exactly $100,000 in cash by tomorrow morning so she could disappear before the gala started. She begged me to help her, saying I was the only one who truly understood how dangerous Jamal had become. I told Brittany to meet me at 6 in the morning at an exclusive members-only executive lounge downtown. I knew the security there was incredibly tight, and they would guarantee us a soundproof private meeting room far away from prying eyes. I woke up at 4 in the morning to prepare my countermeasures. I pulled my corporate emergency funds from a secure overnight safe in my home office. I packed exactly $100,000 in used non-sequential bills into a plain brown leather satchel. I knew Brittany was desperate, but I also knew she was incredibly calculating and ruthless. I had to assume she was wearing a wire herself, or that Jamal had sent her to trap me in some sort of illegal transaction. I equipped myself with the most advanced counter-surveillance gear my private security firm could provide. I wore a thick silk scarf that perfectly concealed a tiny high-definition camera and microphone. I also carried a military-grade signal jammer in my jacket pocket to prevent any live transmission of our conversation to outside receivers. Brittany arrived looking absolutely nothing like the polished social media star who had screamed at me in my corporate lobby. She wore plain black leggings and a baggy gray hooded sweater pulled up over her head. Her face was pale and completely devoid of makeup, revealing deep dark circles under her bloodshot eyes. She looked over her shoulder frantically before slipping into the private room and locking the door behind her. She practically threw herself into the heavy leather chair across from me. She pushed a small silver encrypted hard drive across the polished glass table with trembling fingers. She begged me to take the drive and give her the money so she could vanish before the sun fully rose over the city. I kept my posture perfectly relaxed and my voice absolutely flat. I told her I would not hand over a single dollar until she explained exactly why she was abandoning the golden child of our family. I demanded to know the absolute truth about her marriage and their glamorous public life. Brittany let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded almost hysterical in the quiet room. She wiped her eyes and confessed that their entire marriage was nothing but a carefully orchestrated business arrangement. She told me her influencer career was dying 2 years ago, and she desperately needed a massive rebrand to keep her sponsors. Jamal had approached her with a mutually beneficial proposal. He needed a beautiful, high-profile wife to make his fake cryptocurrency startup look legitimate to older, wealthy investors. She needed a wealthy, charismatic husband to sell the ultimate luxury lifestyle to her 2 million naive followers. Brittany admitted they had created a totally fake narrative of Black excellence and generational wealth to manipulate their respective audiences. They rented luxury cars by the hour and borrowed designer clothes just to take photos for social media. She told me the illusion completely shattered last week when she woke up in the middle of the night and caught Jamal frantically shredding legal documents in his home office. She waited until he passed out from pure exhaustion and then broke into his hidden digital vault. She found out that the supposed millions in his offshore bank accounts were entirely fabricated. Jamal had been running a textbook Ponzi scheme using funds from new church investors to pay aggressive underground loan sharks just to keep himself alive. She told me Jamal was completely broke and drowning in federal tax evasion charges. The worst part was that she had discovered his secret flight itinerary. He had only booked one first-class ticket to Dubai for himself. He had secretly forged her signature to transfer the lease of their luxury penthouse apartment into her name and named her as the primary guarantor on his latest massive business loans. He was planning to take my $1 million gala investment and vanish forever, leaving her behind to take the fall for all the federal fraud and face the wrath of the violent underground syndicate. She said Jamal had intentionally set her up to be the perfect distraction while he escaped across the world. I listened to her pathetic story, feeling nothing but cold, calculated satisfaction. My hidden camera was recording every single detail of her willing admission to federal wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out the thick stacks of cash. I placed the money on the glass table directly next to her encrypted hard drive. I told her she could take the money and run, but first she had to sign a binding legal confession detailing every illegal action Jamal had taken against my parents and my company. I slid the paperwork and a pen toward her. Brittany did not even read the document. She just grabbed the pen and signed her name with frantic, desperate speed. She reached for the cash with greedy hands, but before her fingers could touch the bills, a massive crash echoed through the quiet lounge. The heavy mahogany door to our private room was violently kicked open, splintering the expensive wood around the lock mechanism. Jamal stood in the doorway, looking like a cornered wild animal. His clothes were soaked with sweat, and his eyes darted around the room with manic, terrifying intensity. He held a heavy steel wrench tightly in his right hand. He screamed at Brittany, calling her a backstabbing rat and a worthless traitor. He told her she was incredibly stupid to think she could outsmart him. He pointed to her designer handbag sitting on the floor and revealed he had sewn a military-grade tracking device into the lining months ago because he knew she would eventually try to betray him. He said he knew she was copying his hard drive, and he had followed her signal straight to the lounge. He stepped into the small room and kicked the broken door shut behind him, raising the heavy steel wrench above his head with a terrifying, unhinged smile. Jamal swung the heavy steel wrench downward with a vicious scream aiming directly for Brittany. I did not flinch or scream. I simply pressed the silent panic button concealed on my smartwatch. Before the metal could make contact with her skull, the reinforced oak door was violently kicked open from the hallway. 4 heavily armed private security contractors flooded into the small room. They tackled Jamal mid-swing, slamming him face first into the polished marble floor. The heavy wrench clattered away, sliding under the glass table. Jamal thrashed and roared like a trapped animal, spitting vile curses at Brittany and demanding his money. He fought wildly, but the contractors pinned his arms behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy tactical zip ties. The lounge manager stood in the hallway, looking absolutely horrified by the sudden violence. I stood up slowly, smoothing my jacket. I calmly instructed the security team to haul Jamal out through the underground service elevator and hold him in a secure room until the local police arrived to arrest him for aggravated assault. I looked down at Brittany, who was curled into a tight ball on the floor, sobbing hysterically with her hands covering her head. I picked up the leather satchel full of $100,000 in cash and dropped it onto her lap. I told her to take her money and vanish before the authorities asked her any uncomfortable questions. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the bag of cash to her chest with greedy, desperate hands. She did not even look back at her husband as she sprinted out of the room, leaving the silver-encrypted hard drive sitting perfectly untouched on the glass table. I took the drive back to my secure corporate office and plugged it into an isolated offline laptop. Brittany had told the absolute truth. The drive was an absolute goldmine of federal crimes and financial ruin. I spent hours scrolling through the evidence of Jamal's entirely fabricated life. I found the forged property deeds, the manipulated tax returns, and the fake bank statements he used to lure in new investors. But the most chilling files were the encrypted email chains with the underground gambling syndicate. The mob was completely out of patience. They had sent him photos of my parents' house along with explicit threats stating that if they did not receive their $250,000 by Friday, they would start visiting his listed collateral address to collect their payment in blood. 2 days later, the terror campaign officially began. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a logistics audit when my personal cell phone illuminated with frantically repeated calls from my mother. I let it ring 5 times, listening to the continuous buzzing before I finally answered. My mother was shrieking hysterically into the receiver. She could barely form a coherent sentence. She told me she had woken up to the sound of breaking glass and car alarms. She said someone had slashed all 4 tires on my father's luxury sedan and smashed the windshield to pieces. They had thrown a heavy brick directly through their pristine front bay window, showering their expensive living room in jagged glass. She said there was a terrifying note taped to the brick that simply said, "Time is up. Tell your son we are coming to collect our debt." My father snatched the phone away from my mother. His voice was shaking with absolute terror, but he still tried to sound commanding and authoritative. He demanded that I send my private corporate security team to their house immediately to guard them. He told me I needed to wire the syndicate the money using my executive emergency funds right now. He said I owed it to the family to protect them from these violent street criminals, and that it was my duty to step up and save my parents. I listened to his panicked breathing, keeping my own voice perfectly flat and entirely unaffected. I asked him why he was begging his disappointing spinster daughter for financial rescue, instead of calling his billionaire genius son. My mother grabbed the phone back, sobbing loudly into the microphone. She told me I was being unbelievably cruel and heartless in their moment of terror. She said Jamal was just a victim of bad business partners who had taken advantage of his trusting Christian nature. She insisted Jamal was a good boy who had simply made a tiny mistake and was currently working day and night to fix the situation. She claimed the mob was framing him to steal his legitimate cryptocurrency empire and ruin his brilliant reputation. She begged me to just pay the violent men so Jamal could focus on his upcoming public triumph at the charity gala. They genuinely believed that even after he forged their signatures, stole their home, and left them to face violent criminals, he was still their perfect golden child, who could do no wrong. I sat back in my leather chair feeling a profound sense of closure washing over me. I told them they were completely delusional. I reminded them that just a few nights ago, they sat in their fine dining room laughing at me while actively plotting to steal my entire life savings to fund Jamal's escape to Dubai. I told them I knew all about the first-class flight tickets and the luxury penthouse. I told them I knew Jamal had zero intention of paying the syndicate. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I told them I knew all about the forged second mortgage and the ruthless loan shark who actually owned the deed to the house they were currently standing in. The line went completely dead silent. The horrific truth hit them like a physical blow, shattering their perfect illusion. My father tried to speak, but his voice was reduced to a pathetic, dry stammer asking me how I knew about the house deed. I did not answer his pathetic question. I told my parents that I would not send my security team to protect them, and I would not wire a single penny to save their house from the mob. I told them that since Jamal was such an incredibly successful and wealthy entrepreneur, they should just sit tight in their shattered living room and wait for him to rescue them. I suggested they sweep up the broken glass, put on their best formal wear, and look forward to their golden boy, magnificent public debut. I told them Jamal would surely fix everything and shower them in riches at the charity gala on Saturday night. Then I coldly terminated the call, turning off my phone and leaving them completely alone in the dark with the monsters they had created. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of absolute focus. I did not hear from my parents again after I hung up the phone. I imagined them huddled in their drafty living room, staring at the broken glass and praying for their golden boy to save them. Saturday evening finally arrived, bringing a crisp chill to the city air. The annual Children Charity Gala was being held at the Grand Botanical Conservatory downtown. It was the most exclusive event of the season, where the wealthiest families and corporate executives gathered under massive glass domes filled with exotic flowers. I spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing my wardrobe with the precision of a soldier preparing for a final mission. I wore a tailored emerald green evening gown that felt like armor. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot and my makeup was sharp and unyielding. I carried a small black velvet clutch. Inside that clutch was a single silver encrypted hard drive and a folded legal contract. That was all the weaponry I needed to completely dismantle my family. I arrived at the conservatory and handed my keys to the valet. The entrance was a dazzling display of flashing cameras and red carpets. I bypassed the photographers and slipped into the main ballroom, standing in the shadows near a massive display of white orchids. I did not have to wait long for the main event to begin. A roar of a high-performance engine echoed right outside the glass entrance doors. I watched through the transparent walls as Jamal pulled up to the valet stand in a bright red rented exotic sports car. He stepped out of the low vehicle wearing a tailored designer tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He practically strutted up the red carpet, flashing his perfect, charismatic smile at the local society reporters. He posed for several photos, pointing finger guns at the cameras and acting like he was the undisputed king of the city. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that he was drowning in federal fraud and hunted by violent criminals. He was fully intoxicated by the illusion of his own absolute superiority. A few moments later, a black town car pulled up directly behind Jamal rented sports car. My parents stepped out into the flashing lights. My mother wore an incredibly expensive silver beaded gown, and her hair was perfectly styled. My father wore a classic black tuxedo and carried himself with his usual arrogant posture. To any outside observer, they looked like the perfect wealthy matriarch and patriarch of a highly successful family. But from my vantage point in the shadows, I could see the truth. My mother's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her evening bag. My father kept glancing over his shoulder with wide, terrified eyes, looking for any sign of the loan shark enforcers who had destroyed his car and threatened his life just 2 days ago. Despite their absolute terror, they rushed up the red carpet to flank Jamal. They clung to his arms, posing for the cameras and smiling with desperate, frantic energy. They were doubling down on their delusion, completely willing to sacrifice everything just to stand in the glow of their fake billionaire son. I watched as Jamal led my parents into the grand ballroom. He immediately began working the room, moving from group to group with his loud, infectious laugh. He shook hands with bank executives and kissed the cheeks of wealthy socialites. He spoke loudly about his revolutionary cryptocurrency platform and hinted heavily about a massive cash injection he was about to receive. He treated the passing waitstaff with careless arrogance, snapping his fingers to demand fresh champagne. My parents shadowed him, mimicking his confidence and nodding along with his every fabricated word. My mother even bragged to a group of doctors about how Jamal was going to single-handedly reshape the global financial market. They were completely disconnected from reality, believing that if they just played their parts perfectly, the nightmare waiting for them back home would somehow magically disappear. Jamal spotted me standing near the botanical display. His eyes lit up with predatory greed when he saw me. He excused himself from a group of local politicians and marched directly toward me with my parents trailing closely behind him. Jamal stopped right in front of me, invading my personal space with his arrogant swagger. He did not say hello or ask how I was doing. He immediately looked at my small velvet clutch and asked if I brought the certified check. He told me the local business reporter from the City Chronicle was waiting near the main stage, and he wanted to do the investment presentation in exactly 20 minutes. He said he had already prepared a beautiful speech about family loyalty and overcoming adversity to achieve Black excellence. My father leaned in and told me I was finally doing the right thing. He said this public investment would prove to everyone that our family was strong and united. He kept shifting his weight nervously, clearly desperate for the money transfer to happen so he could feel safe again. My mother forced a tight smile and told me she was so proud of me for recognizing Jamal's true genius. She reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back coldly. I looked at their desperate, greedy faces and felt absolutely nothing but cold resolve. I patted my black velvet clutch and told Jamal I had everything prepared for the ultimate reveal. I promised him it would be a presentation nobody in this room would ever forget. Jamal grinned widely and patted my shoulder before turning around to gather the press photographers. My parents followed him eagerly, leaving me alone in the shadows once more. The orchestra music swelled, filling the massive glass dome with classical melodies. I reached into my clutch to retrieve the federal investment contract and the silver hard drive, preparing to step into the light and end this charade. Just as my fingers touched the cold metal of the drive, my phone vibrated sharply against my palm. It was an urgent, high-priority text message from Julian, my corporate lawyer. I opened the screen and read the brief words. The message made the blood freeze in my veins. Julian told me that his Federal Bureau of Investigation contact had just intercepted a dark web communication from the underground gambling syndicate. The mob was not waiting for tomorrow morning to collect their money. Julian wrote that a team of violent enforcers had already breached the perimeter of the Botanical Conservatory. He warned me that they were currently moving through the grand ballroom completely undetected because they were heavily armed and disguised as the private catering staff. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as Julian's text message burned into my brain. The underground gambling syndicate was not waiting for tomorrow morning. I slowly lowered my phone and scanned the Grand Botanical Conservatory, My eyes drifted past the wealthy socialites and local politicians laughing under the massive glass dome. I focused on the perimeter of the room where the catering staff circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. Suddenly they were glaringly obvious. Four broad-shouldered men with thick necks and cold, dead eyes were wearing the crisp white shirts and black vests of the event staff. They were not serving drinks. They were moving in a slow, deliberate formation, completely surrounding the main stage area. They were sealing off every possible exit strategy Jamal might have. A sharp tap on a microphone echoed through the glass dome, cutting through the low hum of classical music and polite conversation. The event organizer took the center stage and enthusiastically introduced the man of the hour. He described Jamal as a visionary, a financial genius, and a pillar of the community. The crowd erupted into polite applause. My parents clapped louder than anyone else, their faces flushed with absolute triumph. They truly believed they had survived the storm and were about to be crowned royalty. Jamal practically bounded up the stairs to the stage. He adjusted his expensive designer tuxedo jacket and smiled a blindingly arrogant smile. He took the microphone and began a practice speech full of empty buzzwords. He talked about his fake cryptocurrency startup as if it were going to change the world. He praised his own resilience and unmatched intellect. He soaked up the adoration of the crowd, completely oblivious to the four fake caterers who had just locked the doors at the back of the room. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed his own lies. Then Jamal turned his attention to me. He pointed me out in the shadows and asked the crowd to give a round of applause for his little sister. He chuckled softly into the microphone and made a condescending joke about how it took me years of struggling in my small business to finally understand the value of real wealth. He told the audience that he had always tried to guide his naive sister, and that tonight she was finally taking his advice by making a substantial investment in his global vision. He painted himself as a benevolent savior, graciously allowing his lesser sibling to ride his coattails to success. My mother laughed loudly from the front row, looking at me with an expression of smug superiority. My father nodded in agreement, looking relieved that his golden boy was about to receive the ultimate financial bailout. Jamal extended his hand and invited me to join him on the stage to present the seed capital. The spotlight hit me directly. I gripped my small black velvet clutch and stepped out of the shadows. I walked up the carpeted stairs with perfectly measured steps. My emerald green evening gown brushed against the floor as I approached the podium. The heat of the spotlight felt intensely heavy, but my mind was completely cold and focused. Jamal leaned in, expecting me to pull a certified check for $1 million out of my bag. He whispered a harsh command, telling me to smile for the cameras and hand over the money quickly so he could finish his victory lap. I did not smile at him. I simply opened my clutch and pulled out the silver encrypted hard drive that Brittany had given me. Jamal's face contorted in confusion for a brief second. He asked me what I was doing. I ignored him completely and stepped past him to the multimedia console attached to the podium. I slid the silver drive into the main projector port. I took the microphone from the stand and looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. I told the audience that Jamal had promised them an unforgettable presentation about family loyalty and absolute financial transparency. I said I was honored to provide exactly that. I pressed the master display button on the podium console. The classical music abruptly faded away. The massive digital projector screen hanging directly behind Jamal illuminated the entire ballroom. The crowd went completely silent. My parents leaned forward in their front row seats, expecting to see a massive corporate logo or a digital rendering of $1 million check. Instead, a highly detailed scanned image of a legal document filled the 50-foot screen. It was the illegal underground loan agreement for $250,000, with my father's forged signature highlighted in bright yellow ink. The address of my parents' home was clearly visible as the primary collateral. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. My father's face drained of all color as he recognized his own falsified handwriting. Jamal whipped his head around to look at the screen, and his arrogant smile instantly dissolved into a mask of pure, absolute terror. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the microphone stand. Before he could even process that his stolen deed was public knowledge, I clicked the presentation remote a second time. The screen flashed and displayed a massive, undeniable federal document. It was a high-resolution copy of an active Federal Bureau of Investigation warrant for Jamal's immediate arrest, detailing millions of dollars in wire fraud and international money laundering. The stark black text of the federal warrant loomed over the entire ballroom, sealing his fate. I looked out at the disguised catering staff moving closer to the stage and knew there was no escape left for the golden child. The entire ballroom erupted into a chorus of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The wealthy investors and socialites pointed at the massive screen reading the undeniable federal charges with wide, horrified eyes. My mother let out a strangled shriek and grabbed my father's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his tuxedo jacket. I stood perfectly still at the podium, gripping the cold metal of the microphone. I looked directly at Jamal, who was sweating profusely and trembling under the bright stage lights. I raised the microphone to my mouth and my voice echoed through the glass conservatory, completely shattering his golden illusion. I told the audience exactly who the real Jamal was. I explained how he had systematically drained my parents' retirement accounts and forged their signatures to secure illegal loans from violent street criminals. I broke down his entire financial scam for the room of stunned executives. I loudly explained how he had exploited the $999 gift tax rule to slowly siphon family money into offshore accounts. I told them he had convinced our parents to constantly wire him exactly $999 day after day, claiming it was a brilliant tax loophole for his tech startup. He told them it would avoid triggering federal reporting thresholds so they could maximize their investment. I made sure every single person in that room understood that his supposed cryptocurrency empire was nothing more than a pathetic front to pay off his massive illegal gambling debts. The very money my parents had blindly handed over to fund his extravagant lifestyle had gone straight into the pockets of the underground syndicate. Every single microtransaction they sent him went directly to his mob bookies to keep them from breaking his legs. Jamal's face contorted into a mask of pure animalistic panic. The confident swagger he had paraded around all night was completely gone, replaced by the frantic movements of a trapped rat. He lunged toward the podium, screaming at me to shut my mouth and calling me a jealous liar. He clawed at the multimedia console, desperately trying to rip the thick black projector cords right out of the wall. He yanked and pulled at the tangled wires, his expensive designer tuxedo jacket tearing at the shoulder seam. He was sweating and hyperventilating, knocking over a heavy glass vase of rare white orchids in the process. The floral arrangement shattered violently across the polished wooden stage, sending water and broken glass everywhere. The massive digital screen behind us flickered wildly as he tore at the connections, but my encrypted flash drive remained firmly locked in place behind a protective plastic housing. He fell to his knees, frantically pulling at cables and begging the audience not to believe the insane lies of his bitter sister. But nobody was listening to his pathetic excuses anymore. The four heavy-set men disguised in catering uniforms stopped pretending to serve champagne. They dropped their silver trays onto the nearest tables, letting the expensive crystal glasses shatter against the marble floor. They began moving purposefully toward the stage, walking right past the stunned security guards. Their cold, dead eyes were locked directly on Jamal. My father finally realized what was happening. He looked from the terrifying men in the white shirts up to the projected loan document on the screen. The reality of the violent threat had finally breached the thick walls of his absolute delusion. He tried to step backward, pulling my mother with him, but he was completely frozen by fear, trapped between the approaching mob enforcers and the stage where his ruined son was currently thrashing around in spilled water and broken glass. I refused to let Jamal have even a single moment to catch his breath or try to talk his way out of the trap. He was still ripping at the audio-visual cables when I pressed the final button on my presentation remote. The massive screen shifted from the federal arrest warrant to a blank black display. A sudden loud click echoed through the room, and a crisp audio recording began to play through the massive concert speakers suspended from the botanical dome. It was a recording I had extracted directly from the hidden folders on the silver hard drive Brittany had left behind. The clear, distinct voice of his beautiful trophy wife echoed through the completely silent ballroom. Brittany's voice filled the conservatory, laughing coldly as she spoke to an unidentified man. The sound of clinking cocktail glasses chimed in the background of the audio track. I stood back and let the entire audience listen as Brittany confessed that she had never loved Jamal for a single second. Her recorded voice echoed overhead, stating she only married him for social media clout and to gain immediate access to his wealthy investor network. She laughed cruelly, describing him as a pathetic, insecure mark who was incredibly easy to manipulate because he was so obsessed with appearing successful. Jamal stopped pulling at the cords and slowly looked up, his eyes wide with absolute devastation as he heard his own wife destroy him publicly. Then the final devastating blow played out for the whole room to hear. Brittany cheerfully explained her ultimate exit strategy. She announced to the man on the recording that she had already siphoned her entire share of the stolen cash and was officially filing for divorce before the federal agents could seize his remaining assets. She called him a sinking ship and bragged about leaving him to drown. The crowd of wealthy socialites began to murmur in absolute disgust. Several high-profile investors who had been shaking Jamal's hand just 20 minutes ago immediately pulled out their cell phones and began frantically calling their own lawyers to ensure their assets were protected from his toxic fallout. The beautiful botanical conservatory had transformed into a theater of absolute ruin. My mother let out a loud sobbing wail and covered her face with her hands, finally unable to deny the catastrophic reality of her golden boy. My father's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his knees buckling slightly as the truth washed over him. They had sacrificed their daughter, their home, and their entire life savings for a son who was nothing more than a pathetic con artist. Jamal collapsed fully onto the wet wooden stage floor, pulling his knees to his chest and staring blankly ahead. He was completely broken, his fake empire reduced to dust, while the mob enforcers took their final steps toward the stairs of the stage. The heavy silence in the Grand Botanical Conservatory was suddenly pierced by the sound of dramatic sobbing. Brittany pushed her way through the crowd of stunned socialites and wealthy investors. She practically threw herself toward the edge of the wooden stage, clutching her expensive silk gown and weeping loudly. Her tears were perfectly timed and expertly executed. She fell into her usual routine, playing the innocent, naive victim who had been horribly deceived by the man she loved. She cried out to the audience, claiming she had absolutely no idea about the forged property deeds or the illegal underground loans. She pointed a trembling finger at Jamal, who was still curled on the wet floor, and loudly declared that he was a monster who had manipulated her trusting nature. She begged the wealthy executives in the front row to understand that she was just a dedicated wife who had been blinded by love. She turned her tear-stained face toward the flashing cameras of the local press, hoping her performance would save her carefully curated public image. I stood behind the podium and watched her pathetic display with absolute disgust. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for the woman who had happily spent my parents' stolen retirement funds on designer bags and luxury vacations. I leaned into the microphone and my voice echoed coldly through the massive glass dome, cutting right through her fake sobs. I told the audience that Brittany was putting on a magnificent theatrical performance, but her tears were completely worthless. I told them she was not a naive victim, but a willing and greedy accomplice who knew exactly where every single dirty penny came from. Brittany stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting toward me with pure hatred, before she resumed her loud wailing. She tried to shout over me, claiming I was a jealous spinster, trying to ruin her beautiful life. I simply pressed the button on my presentation remote for the final time. The screen behind Jamal shifted from the federal arrest warrant to a massive display of corporate financial records. I pointed at the high-resolution documents and told the silent room to look closely at the funding structure of Brittany's highly successful luxury lifestyle brand. I explained loudly that her entire influencer empire was a hollow shell company. I walked the audience through the digital money trail, showing exactly how Jamal had funneled the money he stole from the underground gambling syndicate directly into her corporate accounts. Every sponsored trip, Every designer outfit and every lavish party she posted online was entirely bankrolled by the blood money her husband owed to violent criminals. I told the crowd that she was fully aware of the financial crimes because her signature was clearly visible on the transfer approvals. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I announced that the Internal Revenue Service had spent the last 3 months quietly investigating her glamorous shell company. I told the room that federal agents had officially flagged her limited liability corporation for massive tax evasion and international money laundering. I informed her that as of this very morning, the government had completely frozen all of her personal and business bank accounts. She was entirely broke, and the federal auditors were currently preparing criminal indictments with her name clearly printed at the very top. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Brittany's fake tears stopped completely. The mask of the innocent, betrayed wife shattered into a million pieces, revealing the vicious and greedy reality underneath. Her face turned a deep mottled red with pure, unadulterated fury. The wealthy socialites who had been murmuring in sympathy just moments ago physically stepped away from her, treating her like a contagious disease. She was entirely exposed, and she knew it. She turned her absolute rage toward Jamal, who was still rocking back and forth in the puddle of water and broken orchids. She screamed at him with a voice so shrill it seemed to vibrate against the glass ceiling. She called him a pathetic, useless failure who could not even pull off a simple con without dragging her down with him. She cursed him for ruining her life and destroying her perfect reputation. She reached down and violently yanked the massive diamond wedding ring off her finger. She threw the heavy ring directly at Jamal with all her strength. The diamond struck him squarely in the chest and clattered away across the wooden stage, but he did not even flinch. Brittany realized the authorities would be arriving at any moment. She hitched up the skirt of her expensive silk gown and spun around, completely abandoning her ruined husband. She shoved her way aggressively through the crowd of horrified guests, desperate to escape the conservatory before the federal agents arrived to arrest her. She sprinted down the main aisle, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floor. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on the heavy brass handles of the main exit doors at the back of the room. She reached out her hands to push the doors open, but she never made it outside. She violently collided with a solid wall of muscle and stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. The 4 heavy-set men who had been wearing the catering uniforms stepped smoothly into a tight formation, completely blocking the exit. They did not carry silver trays of champagne anymore. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, their cold, dead eyes locked directly on Brittany. The largest mob enforcer looked down at her terrified face with a cruel, unsmiling expression. He reached behind his back and slowly turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking the exit doors with a loud metallic click. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, completely trapping Brittany, Jamal, my parents, and the entire crowd of wealthy guests inside the grand ballroom. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the conservatory rattled violently as Brittany pounded her fists against them, but the massive mob enforcer did not even blink. He simply stood there with his tree-trunk arms crossed over his chest, while the other 3 fake caterers continued their slow, menacing walk toward the main stage. The entire ballroom was trapped in a suffocating bubble of pure panic. Wealthy guests pressed themselves against the glass walls of the dome, too terrified to make a single sound or sudden movement. The elite members of society were completely paralyzed, realizing they were locked in a glass cage with dangerous underground criminals. Suddenly, my mother, Yvonne, shattered the tense silence. She let out a guttural scream of absolute fury and scrambled up the carpeted stairs of the stage. My father, David, was right behind her, his face a dark shade of purple with unhinged rage. They did not run to comfort their broken golden boy, who was still weeping in the puddle of shattered orchids and spilled water. They rushed directly toward me. My mother raised her trembling hands as if she wanted to physically strike me right there behind the corporate podium. David pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and screamed that I was a cold-blooded monster. He yelled that I had intentionally humiliated our proud family in front of the entire city just because I was bitterly jealous of my brother's massive success. Yvonne joined the verbal assault, shrieking that I had single-handedly destroyed Jamal's brilliant future and ruined the greatest night of his entire life. She demanded that I use my personal corporate wealth to pay off the terrifying men walking toward the stage right now. They actually expected me to empty my bank accounts to save the son who had just been exposed as a federal criminal and a fraud. They blamed me for the mob presence and the frozen accounts, claiming none of this would have happened if I had just been a loyal, supportive sister and handed over my money quietly behind closed doors. They still believed Jamal was a victim of my calculated sabotage. I stood my ground, looking at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible and worthless. I felt no anger and no sadness. I only felt a profound sense of absolute finality. I calmly smoothed the skirt of my emerald green gown and slowly unclasped my black velvet clutch for the last time tonight. I reached inside and pulled out a thick folded stack of official legal papers. I held the heavy documents out toward my father. David snatched the papers from my hand, his chest heaving with exertion, as he aggressively smoothed out the crumpled pages, expecting to see some sort of fake evidence. I leaned into the microphone so the entire trapped audience could hear every single word of their ultimate ruin. I calmly instructed David to read the bold print at the top of the front page. I told them it was the official secondary mortgage contract for their beautiful, pristine, luxury suburban home. I explained that their perfect golden child had secretly forged both of their signatures on this exact document exactly 6 months ago, using a corrupt notary he had bribed with their own stolen money. I told them he had used their beloved family home as direct collateral to secure a massive high-interest loan from a shadow bank connected to the very syndicate currently standing in the room. Yvonne stopped screaming and forcefully grabbed the papers from David's hands. Her eyes frantically scanned the forged signatures and the terrifying financial figures printed clearly on the page. I told them that Jamal had completely defaulted on every single monthly payment, choosing, instead, to spend the cash on luxury cars and expensive jewelry for a wife who was currently trying to abandon him. I looked my parents directly in the eyes and delivered the final crushing truth. I told them the shadow bank had officially initiated the absolute foreclosure process. I said, "Congratulations, the bank is seizing the house tomorrow morning, and you have absolutely nowhere left to go." I told them they had blindly sacrificed their daughter, their dignity, and their entire life savings just to protect a pathetic thief who did not even care if they ended up completely homeless on the street. The devastating reality of my words hit David and Yvonne like a physical shockwave. The heavy legal papers slipped from my mother's hands and fluttered down onto the wet wooden stage. Yvonne's legs simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto her knees right next to the broken glass, her expensive silver-beaded gown soaking up the muddy water. She let out a hollow, devastated sound that was barely human, rocking back and forth as her entire world dissolved into nothing. David stumbled backward, clutching his chest, as if he were having a severe heart attack. He looked from me to the forged documents on the floor, and then finally turned his gaze to Jamal. He stared at his golden boy with absolute horror, finally seeing the parasitic monster he had created and nurtured all these years. He waited for Jamal to speak up and deny the accusations, to call me a liar one last time. But Jamal could not even look his father in the eye. He just kept his head buried in his hands, sobbing pathetically while the mob enforcers reached the bottom of the stage stairs. The Grand Botanical Conservatory was completely silent, except for the sound of my parents weeping bitterly over their destroyed lives. The wealthy audience watched the total collapse of the family they had just been applauding. But then another sound pierced the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Faint at first, but rapidly growing louder, a chorus of high-pitched wails echoed through the downtown city streets. The distinct, piercing shriek of police sirens cut through the cold night air, approaching the glass dome from every possible direction. Flashing red and blue lights began to bounce off the transparent walls of the conservatory, signaling that the absolute end had finally arrived. The massive mob enforcer, who had been standing like a brick wall in front of the exit, slowly reached behind his back and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, unlocking the doors. He pulled the tall handles wide open and immediately stepped backward, melting seamlessly into the panicked crowd of socialites like a ghost in the night. A tactical team of federal agents and local police officers poured into the grand botanical room. Their heavy black boots pounded against the polished marble floor, completely shattering the delicate illusion of the high society gala. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, pushing past the shrieking executives and wealthy investors who scrambled out of their way like frightened animals. The lead federal agent marched directly down the center aisle, keeping his hard eyes locked entirely on the ruined man sobbing on the wet wooden stage. Jamal did not even try to run or hide. He stayed curled on the floor among the crushed white orchids and the spilled water as the agents rapidly surrounded the corporate podium. The lead agent reached down and grabbed Jamal by the shoulder of his torn designer tuxedo jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet like a limp rag doll. The agent loudly declared that Jamal was under arrest for multiple felony counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and international money laundering. The harsh metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the silent glass dome sounded like a death knell for the golden child. Jamal's face was completely slick with sweat, and tears, his arrogant, confident posture entirely replaced by the trembling weakness of a terrified coward. They pushed his chest forcefully against the multimedia console to search his pockets, roughly extracting the expensive keys to the luxury cars that the bank would inevitably be repossessing by morning. My parents watched the entire brutal sequence in a state of absolute catatonic shock. Yvonne was still on her knees in the dirty water, her hands covering her mouth to muffle her continuous hysterical sobbing. David stood completely frozen, staring blankly at the federal agents manhandling his perfect, successful son. The flawless family legacy he had sacrificed everything to protect was currently being read his rights in front of the most powerful people in the city. The illusion of their superior bloodline was completely dead. They were bankrupt, humiliated, and permanently tied to a federal criminal. As the agents began to lead Jamal toward the edge of the stage, he suddenly dug his expensive leather shoes into the carpeted stairs. He twisted his body around, fighting frantically against the strong grip of the officers, and locked his desperate, tear-filled eyes on me. He dropped heavily to his knees, the hard impact tearing the expensive fabric of his trousers. He dragged his body forward through the spilled water, completely ignoring the sharp pieces of broken glass slicing into his knees and ruining his clothes. He stretched his handcuffed wrists out toward the hem of my emerald green evening gown. He began to beg me, sobbing hysterically and pleading for his life in front of the entire stunned audience. He promised he would pay me back every single penny if I just used my corporate wealth to help him this one last time. He screamed that we were blood, that I was his little sister, and that he desperately needed me to post his federal bail. He cried that he would not survive a single night in a federal holding cell and begged me to save him from absolute ruin. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man clutching at the empty air near my feet. I thought about every single time he had mocked my small business and laughed at my daily struggles. I thought about the years he spent treating me like an embarrassing failure while secretly stealing from the parents who worshipped him blindly. I looked at his shaking hands reaching for my financial salvation. I did not feel a single ounce of familial loyalty or pity. I calmly lifted my heel and kicked his outstretched hands away from my dress. I looked him dead in the eye, and my voice carried clearly across the silent room. I told him that a cheapskate does not have bail money. Jamal let out a broken wailing sound as the complete finality of my rejection hit him. The federal agents had seen enough of the pathetic display. They grabbed him by the upper arms and hauled him backward, dragging him away from the podium and marching him down the center aisle of the conservatory. The wealthy crowd parted like the Red Sea, refusing to even look at him as he was paraded out the doors in pure disgrace. My parents scrambled after him, weeping and calling his name, but the local police officers formed a solid line, blocking them from getting close to the exit. While all the attention was focused on Jamal being dragged out into the cold night air, Brittany was quietly trying to execute her own selfish escape. She had smoothed down her expensive silk gown and wiped the angry flush from her face, replacing it with her carefully practiced mask of innocent victimization. She sidled up to one of the local police officers near the main exit, putting a trembling hand on his arm and speaking in a soft, frightened whisper. She tried to tell him that she was just the terrified, abused wife of a monster, and she needed to go home immediately to recover from the massive shock. She batted her tear-filled eyelashes, expecting her beauty and white tears to give her a free pass out of the disaster zone. But her dramatic performance failed miserably. A female federal agent stepped out from behind the local officer, holding a thick manila folder filled with the exact financial documents I had just broadcasted to the entire room. The agent looked at Brittany with absolute contempt and informed her that she was not going anywhere tonight. The agent stated loudly that the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already secured a warrant for her arrest as a direct co-conspirator. She explained that Brittany's signature on the shell company funding documents made her fully culpable as an active accomplice to the financial crimes and massive tax evasion. Brittany's jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated horror. She let out an ear-piercing shriek as the agent grabbed her wrists and forcefully pulled them behind her back. She thrashed and kicked violently, screaming that she was a famous influencer and a victim throwing a massive, embarrassing tantrum while the cold, steel handcuffs locked tightly around her own wrists, sealing her fate right next to the husband she had just tried to abandon. The heavy steel doors of the police transport vans slammed shut with a harsh metallic thud that echoed through the cold night air. I stood on the polished marble steps of the Grand Botanical Conservatory and watched the flashing red and blue lights disappear down the long, dark driveway. The dangerous mob enforcers had melted away into the shadows during the initial chaos, leaving my ruined family completely surrounded by armed federal agents and local police officers. The massive high society gala that was supposed to be the ultimate celebration of my brother, fake genius, had transformed into the absolute destruction of his entire life. The following months passed in a relentless blur of sterile federal courtrooms and harsh, undeniable legal realities. Jamal's elaborate house of cards had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of the massive government investigation. His criminal trial became a highly publicized media circus. Every local news station broadcasted the pathetic, embarrassing details of his fraudulent cryptocurrency empire and his massive illegal gambling debts. He sat at the defense table looking incredibly small and weak in his bright orange prison jumpsuit, his golden child arrogance completely erased by pure terror. The federal judge showed absolutely no mercy during the final sentencing hearing. He looked down from his high wooden bench and publicly berated Jamal, calling him a parasitic fraud who had willingly destroyed his own parents just to feed his massive, fragile ego. Jamal wept uncontrollably as the judge struck the gavel and sentenced him to 8 long years in a maximum security federal prison. There would be no early parole and no special treatment for the man who had stolen millions. Brittany received her own harsh dose of absolute reality during her separate criminal proceedings. Her expensive defense lawyers desperately tried to argue that she was just a naive, innocent influencer who had been horribly tricked by a manipulative husband. But the federal prosecutors easily destroyed her pathetic victim routine in front of the entire jury. They methodically presented the signed bank transfer approvals and played the crystal-clear audio recordings of her bragging about laundering the stolen money through her fake lifestyle brand. The Internal Revenue Service systematically seized every single asset she had ever acquired with the dirty money. Federal agents confiscated her entire designer wardrobe, her fleet of luxury cars, and drained her pristine offshore bank accounts, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison for her undeniable role as an active, willing accomplice in the massive financial crimes. She shrieked and fought against the bailiffs as they led her out of the courtroom, her fake glamorous image completely stripped away and replaced by absolute ruin. David and Yvonne faced a much different kind of miserable prison. The morning after the disastrous gala, the Shadow Bank officially executed the accelerated foreclosure on their beautiful luxury suburban home. The local sheriff deputies arrived before noon, forcing my parents to pack whatever meager belongings they could carry into cheap black trash bags and leave the property forever. Their wealthy neighbors stood on their manicured lawns and watched the humiliating spectacle in complete silence. My parents had blindly sacrificed their entire life savings and their daughter dignity to protect a pathetic thief, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. They were forced to move into a cramped, subsidized apartment complex on the very edge of the industrial district. The thin walls, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the constant smell of damp mildew were a brutal daily reminder of the perfect affluent life they had foolishly thrown away. With their retirement accounts completely drained to pay off Jamal's initial mob debts, they had absolutely no choice but to find grueling minimum wage employment in their old age. David, who used to brag endlessly about his prestigious executive connections and his superior intellect, now spent his days pushing a heavy, wet mop and collecting loose shopping carts in a freezing grocery store parking lot. Yvonne, who used to host lavish catered dinner parties specifically to mock my small business, now worked the graveyard shift as a supermarket cashier. She spent her nights scanning cheap canned goods for exhausted factory workers while her feet swelled and her back ached from the endless physical labor. The desperate misery of their new reality finally shattered their lifelong delusion of superiority. My phone began to ring constantly at all hours of the day and night. My voicemail inbox quickly filled up with pathetic sobbing messages from David and Yvonne. They called me repeatedly, begging for my forgiveness and pleading for a second chance at being a real family. Yvonne would cry hysterically into the receiver, telling me that she had made a terrible mistake and that I was the only family they had left in the world. David would leave long, rambling, tearful apologies admitting that they had been completely blind to Jamal's true nature and begging me to help them pay their past due utility bills. They desperately hoped that my natural empathy and my newfound corporate wealth would save them from the miserable, grinding poverty they had created for themselves. I sat in my spacious corner office, looking out over the downtown skyline, and listened to their desperate voices one final time. I felt no lingering anger and no petty desire for revenge. I simply felt a profound, absolute peace. I deleted every single message and contacted my service provider to permanently change my phone number, completely erasing them from my existence. My life had transformed beautifully in the absolute absence of their toxic, suffocating weight. The board of directors at my company had recognized my sharp instincts, my flawless integrity, and my unwavering dedication to the business. Just last week, they had officially promoted me to the position of Chief Executive Officer, granting me full creative and financial control of the entire corporate division. I no longer needed to seek validation from people who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible and worthless. I had built my own empire from the ground up through sheer determination and absolute resilience. I leaned back into the plush leather seat of my private first-class suite. The massive jet engines hummed smoothly as the plane soared high above the bright blue, sparkling ocean. I was flying to the Maldives for a month-long solo celebration, enjoying the profound luxury of a life I had truly earned with my own two hands. A flight attendant with a warm, genuine smile handed me a crystal flute filled with expensive vintage champagne. I took a slow sip, savoring the sweet, cold taste of absolute victory. I looked out the small oval window at the endless, beautiful horizon, stretching out before me, completely free from the parasites who had tried to drag me down. Actions have consequences, and I was finally exactly where I belonged. The greatest lesson here is that blood does not excuse betrayal, and enabling toxic behavior will ultimately destroy you. David and Yvonne spent their lives protecting a manipulative thief while punishing the only person who actually worked hard. They chose an illusion of perfection over genuine family and lost everything. You can never heal in the exact environment that broke you. True freedom comes from cutting ties with those who drain your soul and building your own empire from the ground up. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share your experiences below.